Charlie! Lola? Charlie! Charlie and Lola! I wish I could draw exactly more like you.
I have this little sister, Lola. She is small and very funny. And she's a very good drawer.
My picture is of summer. And the sun is all yellow. Oh, or maybe it's a big flower. With ladybirds and bumblebees. My picture is of a house. Ooh, that looks a bit like a slide. Maybe if I was a ladybird, I could slide down it. Whee! Here, look. I'm very good at drawing houses. I want to do it. We all have to do a house, Lotta. That's what Mrs. Hanson said. I can't wait to do my house.
Can we do
Charlie, yes. We have to draw a picture of our house for Open Visiting School Day.
Everyone in the school has to draw one.
Oh, I'm really good at drawing houses.
I'm going to put sizzles in my house.
Come on. You live in a high-up house. Marv lives in a high-up house. But his house is a bit slightly different from ours.
Yes, there are all sorts of different houses. There are round houses. Very tall houses.
Oh, they are tall.
Some houses are built on stilts.
Wow. Oh.
Moving houses. Ooh. And even houses made out of boats.
Ooh. And I live in a house. Lots of fluffy things.
I'll use this pencil here. A bit hard here.
I'm doing a cutting out and sticking picture. I'm just sharpening my pencil. I like it all pointy. Stick, stick, stick.
Marv, can you pass that pencil from there?
And glitter. Oh, I need it more pointy. I'll just sharpen it again. That's better.
Are there any more magazines? Dad's got lots of old magazines and newspapers in the sitting room. I'll show you.
I need it more pointy, like a mountain. I'll just sharpen it again. Look at my potatoes. They're for the windows. Pitch, pitch, pitch. And lots of leaves. Oh, I need to make my pencil more pointy.
Lots of houses and buildings.
Mm.
You can cut them all up and stick them on.
Yes.
Here's a dog. But it's not a sausage dog like Sizzles. Maybe I can make him look like Sizzles.
More windows. To the sky. Now it is much pointy. Finished. All done. Oh, it is really good, Lotta. But it doesn't look like your house. Because your house has lots of flowers on the outside. Oh, yes. And your door is not in the middle. It is sort of near to the edge bit. Oh, yes. And your house is sort of yellowish. Maybe I'll start my picture again. My pencil needs to be pointy again. Oh, haven't you started yet, Lotta? I'm still thinking how to do my house. I just want it to be exactly like my house. Very exactly. Okay. Maybe I can draw a home like yours. Well, you can if you want, but your house isn't all the way up like mine, and it is all yellowy. I know. The walls are all straight. Oh no, they are not all straight. No. The walls don't have to be completely exactly straight like your house, Lotta. They do. Oh. Woora. This will help me be unwobbly. Up there. I'll colour it in now. All yellowy. Exactly like this one. Oh no! The yellow's all run out. And my house is all yellow. Oh.
Your picture doesn't have to look exactly like your house. Wait there. My picture doesn't look exactly like my house.
Here, what's that? Macaroni. Macaroni? It's all yellow. But my house is not made of macaroni. But it is all bumpy like macaroni. Yes, but you said my picture had to look like my house.
Lotta, there are lots of different ways to do houses. This is a book of Dad's. It's a book of all different artists. Look at this one. It's by an artist called Van Gogh. I think it's Van Gogh, Charlie. And look, the house must be really old because it's all falling down and wobbly.
Wow. Oh, everything does look all very wobbly.
And you can tell what kind of day it is.
It is a very windy day. You can see all the clouds swirling around. And the trees are all swirly too.
Ooh. And look, the paint is really thick.
Ooh, I like using lots of paint.
I like this one. It's by Cedric Morris. It's full of rooftops.
And chimneys.
It's a bit like looking out of our house because we're so high up.
Sometimes I like to wave to people in the window. Hello. Hello.
Hello, Marv. Hi, Charlie.
Hello, Sizzles.
Oh, look. Oh, it looks a bit like a comic. The painter's done lots of little blue lines for wallpaper.
And the carpet is made out of dots. Who did it?
Somebody called Lichtenstein.
Ooh, and everything is very neat. 2 lamps.
2 pillows. Sizzles, drop it.
And 2 bedside tables. Oh, it's not very bouncy. Our bedroom is much more messier than his. We should tidy up. Tidy.
Oh,
and who painted this one?
It's by Henry Matisse.
Ooh, this one looks a bit like our house. There are lots of patterns everywhere. Patterny walls, patterny floors, patterny table. Oh, he would like my patterny dress, wouldn't he, Charlie?
Yes, he would.
Oh, look! Even the things out of the window look like patterns. I do like it. Maybe I will do my house in macaroni because the walls are all bumpy and the roof is all wobbly because my house is very old. And I have got a chimney and curtains with lots of patterns.
I'll cut this out for you.
Glue it, glue it, glue it, glue it.
Here, have this crayon, Lotta.
Now I draw the chimney. Shh! Make the roof all wobbly. Wobble.
I like that one. That one's really good.
Oh.
Oh. Look at mine.
Wow.
That's really good. But I've never seen aliens outside our house. Yours isn't bad, Charlie.
Oh, that's mine!
Well done, Lola.
Ooh, Lotta. That does look like your house. Because it is very wobbly. Well, that is because it was a very, very, very windy day.